If you can see the tally marks, it's already too late. By yours truly. I need your help. 4 simple words was all that was written on the torn note, stuffed inside the little silver locket that arrived via courier at my door that fateful autumn morning. It was written in her normally perfectly measured hand, now rushed and sloppy in desperation, the deep red ink looking more and more like blood, rather than rolled out from the fountain pens she always used. I had given her the heart-shaped locket on its little silver chain for our 3rd anniversary, and had never seen her in life without it. Though, to be fair, we had never seen her in death either, and though she had been declared legally dead 6 months ago, part of me still held out hope that the investigators in charge of looking into her disappearance had been wrong. They were, after all, incompetent enough to suspect me. What more would you expect from small-town police in the heart of the Bible Belt when a beautiful young woman goes missing? It must be the doings of her godless lover. Lipstick lesbians were tolerable, poor souls, just confused after being hurt by a man. They'll come around. But a woman like myself, more butch than Cassidy, with my shaggy brown hair styled with an unapologetic undercut and a penchant for snapbacks, I was clearly beyond saving, and thus hauled down to the local PD on 3 separate occasions, grilled for hours about her location, details of what harm I had done to her, and demands that I tell the truth before gods and men. What an utter load of crock. I would never have laid a hand on her, nor harmed a single red hair on her head. I alone loved her for who she truly was, embraced her eccentricities, and revelled in her dreams. I was the one who reported her missing to the police, after she did not return home that night. I searched alone when the community would not organise a proper search of the park she had gone exploring in, seeking in vain the entrance to the underground labyrinth she said that she had discovered. And when her family, despite my protests, buried an empty casket in her memory, I sat alone, devastated and destroyed, just out of sight, and mourned the love of my life. And now here it was, resting in my shaking hands, proof she was alive, or at least had been, when this note was written. And I knew what I must do as I slung the chain around my neck, the locket resting just under my collarbones, as I had seen it on her so many times before. I liked to think it was her prized possession, as she had been mine. I darted up the stairs and reached blindly under the bed for my bug-out bag, my palm touching the empty space where hers had been, with her snagging the canvas strap of my own. How she had made fun of me mercilessly for not having one to call my own. I had no idea what was inside, as she had finally relented and packed it herself, but as I trusted her judgment, as I always did, I did not bother to look inside. In less than 5 minutes, I had laced up my hiking boots, grabbed my trusty snapback off its hook by the door, and was in the car driving towards the state park entrance, nothing in my mind except the small scribbled note. I need your help. She was going to get it. Wherever she was, whatever had happened, it didn't matter. She was alive somewhere, alive and in danger, and in need of my help. I floored the accelerator pedal on my second-hand Subaru, ignoring stop signs and only barely slide as I pass the entrance gate to the state park. Tyres sliding to a stop in the dirt and gravel of the small parking lot just before the inner gate that stood as metal protection against motor vehicles. I hadn't the slightest idea where I was headed as I hopped the little gate, the black canvas bag slung over my shoulder, but it hardly mattered. I followed her favourite path away from the main cobbled pavement meant for the tourists, following the worn section of dirt out into the forestry as I had done many times before with her, picturing her smile and how she had laughed as the dogs always fought to get off leash to run rampant through the woods. One day, I had promised her, she would have a cabin where the land, with enough land where they could roam free and wild, like she longed to. Just another in a series of promises that I had made before destiny stole her from my life and the world itself. The woods grew more dense around me, blocking out most of the afternoon light as it fought its way to stream through the ever-thickening canopy above, and as I pressed onwards, the worn trail beneath my feet grew less and less travelled until I was without a guide on which way to continue forward. Erring after what she often said, I bore slightly to the left, and each time I came upon an obstruction, whether a downed tree or a large cropping of rocks, I would continue leftward before attempting to straighten out, lest I find myself going in a circle. The afternoon was a warm one, and muggy besides, though the distant smell of rain filtered down through the branches with the wind that must have been passing pleasantly above. Figures. I checked the watch on my wrist, the little glowing bluish-green numbers indicating it was just after 6:30 in the afternoon. It certainly hadn't felt like we had been trekking through the park for the better part of 4 hours, but then I do tend to lose track of time when my mind was singularly focused on a task, and this task was no other. I would find her, I told myself, as I pressed onwards. As twilight began to descend around me, and the buzzing gnats and mosquitoes made their presence known in their swirling little clouds around my face, often landing on my arms and causing me to slap at the skin, I finally slid to a stop and opened the bag for the first time in hopes of finding some sort of repellent. And of course, there was a little aerosol bottle nestled between a length of rope and a rain poncho, one of those little portable ones that filled up into a pocket that served as a drawstring pouch. That would come in handy when the rain came. I pulled out both and liberally sprayed the foul-smelling repellent all over my arms, neck and clothes before returning it to the pack, and slipping on the poncho after unfolding it from its neat little bundle. I fished around the pack a little more, exploring its contents, and found a flashlight with a hand-cranked battery, some bright flowers, a couple of glow sticks, 3 small bottles of water, a first aid kit, several ready-to-eat meal kits, a small journal with an attached pen, and a sharp-looking survival knife in a thick leather sheath. She really did tend to think of everything, though the journal confused me. It didn't seem to have the same source of benefits in a survival kit as the other items did. Flipping it open, I found out how wrong I was. For there, on the first page, was her beautiful handwriting in black ink, meticulous as ever. It read, "Darling, I hope that it is never needed, but in case it is, know that you are not alone. I shall always be there with you, no matter what happens, close as a heartbeat, and never further than a simple turn to the left. Stiffly, trying to stifle the tears for the words that had been left unread all these years under the bed we once shared, I tucked the journal like a precious gem back into the pack, slung it once more onto my back, and began cranking the flashlight's little handle as I pressed forward. If there was ever a chance that I would have turned back as night fell, it was gone now, replaced with memories of holding her hand in mine, her right hand clutched in my left, fingers interlaced. I would have that again, or I too would disappear into these woods, never to be seen again. Night fell swiftly, and the sounds of the forest creatures, normally chittering happily, were dulled to silence as the first few droplets of rain filtered downwards through the densely packed leaves and branches, splattering heavily on the waterproof material of the poncho. The beam of the flashlight cast a wide wash of yellow orangish colour over the forest floor, laden with fallen branches and rotten leaves, thistles and ferns and prickly thorn bushes that tugged at the denim of my jeans. But still I pressed onwards, half in a daze of remembrance, half in a wild frenzy akin to the first night when she went missing. I should have gone with her. She had said that she had found something interesting, some man-made structure in the middle of the park where it was unlikely to be disturbed. She wanted to explore, but I had to work a show in the city. She was to tell me all about it that night when we both returned home. How foolish I was to not simply call in sick for a day. No one would have questioned it, as my work ethic alone left my teammates in the dust. She always said so. But no, of course not. I couldn't afford to leave my team hanging, and rent was due in a week regardless. As the tears started to well in my eyes, I stumbled more than once on an upturned tree root, lurching forward almost blindly, little thought given to where I was headed, or how I might ever hope to return the way I came. But there, just ahead, we saw the first sign that another living soul had passed through this section of the forest. A pricker bush, crushed in half, as though someone had half fallen, half walked through it, and an upturned rock, its top dark and damp, as if it had been recently turned from the earth by a heavy shoe. Lisa! I half breathed, half choked out her name as I made my way forward, towards the unmistakable sign of life, deep in the park away from the world. Lisa! I shouted this time, as the thorns ripped at the sleeves of my poncho, tearing away small strips of the fabric to dangle in the non-existent breeze. It didn't matter to me that if Lisa had come this way, it would have been at least 3 years ago, and that this was, in all likelihood, evidence of a deer or some other animal having trounced its way through, trying to evade one of the mountain lions that inhabited the park. No, this was Lisa. I was certain of it. And there, in the muddy patch of the forest floor, a tiny little boot print that could only have been hers. She was always so embarrassed about the size of her shoes, after that shopkeep had been astonished at her fitting her quite tiny little fairy feet into a pair of shoes meant for a child. Only Lisa could have made that print. I reached my hand into my pocket to pull out my phone, shielding it from the rain with my left arm as best as I could, in order to take a photo. Here was the evidence, at long last, that what I had told the police was true, that Lisa had gone out into the park, searching for some monument, and never returned. They would have to believe me now. But, of course, my phone was dead. Why wouldn't it be? I had only been trampling around the woods all day and well into the night, in the wind and rain and darkness, and my phone hadn't exactly been at full charge when I left. I had only just returned home from work when the courier showed up with Lisa's locket and his greasy hair and his insistence that he didn't know who had sent the package. Frustrated, I thrust my worthless phone into the pack and fished around blindly until I found it. The little plastic tube of a glow stick. I snapped it between my hands. The brilliant purple colour flared to life. It had a little moulded plastic hook on the top, which I wrapped around a small offshoot of a nearby branch, before pressing inwards in the direction her boot print had been pointed. This way, I hoped, I would be able to find my way back to the tree. Back to the proof that Lisa was out here. Onwards I went, straight through bushes and brambles, hauling myself over slippery fallen trees as the rain plummeted downwards, the canopy above and the forest around me slowly becoming less and less dense as I cried out for Lisa. No reply ever came, except the strangled echo of my own voice as it bounced off the nearby trees to resound faintly and hollow in my ears. At last, I reached a clearing, bathed in a sort of pale, silvery light from the moon above, as if the rain itself were falling streaks of liquid steel, pouring down from the heavens to pool in glistening patches upon the ground, slowly coating the meadow of wildflowers and wild grasses with a sheet as impenetrable as the night sky above. Squinting in the sudden brightness, I slipped the flashlight back into the pocket of the poncho, its little fluorescent beam made redundant by the light shining from every surface, and stumbled forward through the iridescence. Lisa! I gasped into the light, as if her brilliance that illuminated this isolated little patch of woodland heaven around me. Lisa, I'm coming. Onwards I went, slowly finding sure footing amidst the slickness of the silver-stained grass, flecks of the unearthly substance coating my boots and leaving stains upon the patchwork of my jeans. And there, as I pressed onwards through the illumination, the strangely comforting glow of a towering structure in the distance began to come into view. Not as if I were approaching, but rather as if it were coalescing, condensing out of the liquid, silvery substance that dropped down from the unseen clouds in the sky. This must be it, the monument Lisa had said was created by man centuries ago, this monolith to the silvery skies that I had been too busy with work to behold with my beloved. I might have marvelled with her under the rain, the wind teasing softly through her hair, and been awash in delight of her sparkling blue eyes that danced with the flames of passion whenever she found some new indication of an ancient civilization, rather than wandering alone, cold and shivering from my long trip through the rain. I reached up with cold, damp fingers to wipe the rain from my eyes, which slipped around and over my chilled digits with all the resistance of wet silicone, coating my fingers and burning my eyes, but clearing nonetheless. And there, rising out of the meadow before me, a pillar of carved stonework, inlaid with angular marks and symbols, etched into the solid facing with a deliberate and ornamental hand of some ancient artisan. As I approached, I could more clearly make out the pictures and words in some ancient language as the rain slid down the stone face of the pillar and pooled into the bottoms of the carvings, reflecting the moon's light with its silvery surface. I reached out and brushed my chilled fingertips against the stone, finding it surprisingly warm, as though it had been baking in the sun all afternoon, rather than drenched with rain from the autumn skies for hours, as I had been. Or perhaps it was heated somehow from within, some sort of ancient chimney, though no smoke billowed from its top, to dance through the moonlight, as far as I could tell. I took a few steps back in an effort to see the top of the structure, in hopes of determining if it was indeed solid, as it appeared, or else carved and hollowed out. But the meadow was too flat of an expanse, offering no rise with which to gain a vantage point, though it certainly seemed to me that the air directly above the stone plinth had a hazy sort of quality to it, shimmering in the rain and moonlight that reminded me of a distant blacktop on a hot summer's day during the long drive that Lisa and I would take through the countryside on weekends. Lisa. That's why I had come. Lisa needed my help, and this giant tablet was the key to where she had gone. Perhaps it was a doorway to some hidden tomb, or else a marker that would point a traveller in the right direction. Or perhaps some ancient calendar to mark the passage of time by tracking the movement of the sun and stars through the sky. Lisa had spoken of such things often enough during her years of study, and then excitedly after various trips to the Middle East and South America, with her work with the anthropology department with the university where she was employed. I had no real knowledge of languages or cuneiform, save what Lisa would show me when she would babble excitedly about her latest research, or the discovery of some Hobarton archaeologist published in the latest journal. If only I had paid more attention, rather than getting lost in the way that the light in her eyes danced, or how the warm tinge of pink would paint her cheeks when she smiled from ear to ear, I might have been at least able to identify what civilization they were from, or at least some approximation. As I stood, I could hardly make heads or tails of the crude drawings, vaguely human forms with arms uplifted towards what looked to be maybe clouds in the sky rolling over the sun. And there, again, just above the first, interspaced with some more of that unknown writing, another relief. The same human forms with arms lifted, slashed through 100 times with minute vertical lines to indicate the rain. Above this, more writing, and now the humans were on their knees, perhaps in prayer, their heads bowed down, and on the pictures went, up the stone face interspaced with whatever script of this forgotten culture, until they were too high up and out of sight. I circled slowly around and to the left, taking it all in. It wasn't a perfect cylinder, nor was it a rectangular block with sharp edges. It wasn't any particular shape that I could name at all, simply roundish, with an uneven nature to it, as though a naturally occurring boulder had been lifted from the earth and polished again and again, until it was absolutely smooth, all pockmarks and notches from water and the elements removed until its surface gleamed to almost reflect the metallic rainwater bathed in moonlight. Such effort seemed almost a waste, for every spare inch of its surface, as far as I could tell, had been carved with figures and displays and unknown inscriptions, though they too gleamed and reflected the almost abrasive light of the moon on the pooling rainwater. As I circled the plinth slowly, the toe of my boot knocked into something hard and protruding from the grass, and, numb as my feet were from my trek through the rain, I was unable to find my balance again and fell heavily to my knees, though I'm sure the rainwater that had dripped and trained from my pants into my boots hadn't helped matters much either. I grimaced and brushed my tousled hair where it clung in damp tendrils on my face, the wet grass soaking once through the denim of my jeans, and I shivered as I looked closer at what I had quite literally stumbled over. It was some sort of circle of stone with what looked to be a curved handle in the centre of its crudely flattened surface, like some ancient manhole cover. Here too, the surface was marked with pooling silver rain in a series of perfectly straight lines, intersected here and there with horizontal marks of the same calibre at seemingly random intervals, until it was nothing but a maze of interspersed rivers of rainwater that shimmered and scattered the moonlight in 1,000 glowing directions through the hazy air. I reached forward and wrapped my stiff fingers around the curved handle, the width of a baseball bat, and found it pleasantly warm, a breath of life to my chilled flesh. I tugged experimentally, and finding no more resistance than I should have expected from a thing carved of stone, hoisted myself back to my feet. I dropped the bag from my shoulders and grasped it firmly with both hands, bending my knees, and lifted with all of my strength. To my surprise, the cover did not lift straight up, but rather swung more easily than it had any right to, over the grass in some sort of twisting hinge to the right, revealing a large hole into the earth, through which the water dropped, splattering some distance below onto a hard surface in the darkness. I reached into the pocket of the poncho for the flashlight and pressed the trigger to the on position. No response, of course. Frustrated, I began to furiously crank the little handle to power the battery, and it lazily sprang to life, its warm orange light at odds with the silver moonlight. I could see, through the hole, some dark expanse of what appeared to be the same stone as the plinth and cover, with the far edge of the hole extending downwards as a sheer rock face, which appeared to be some ancient stone ladder carved into the wall, hand and footholds carved with even spacing down its face, leading down into the darkness. Lisa would have loved to see such a thing and followed it down at once, and so that is what I did as well. Giving the flashlight a few more cranks, I slipped it into the hood of the poncho, pulling the drawstrings taut so it was supported between the bottom edge of the hood and my chin, and slung the pack, shining with the silver rain, back over my back and headed down, feet first. Slowly, carefully, mindful of the slickness on the soles of my boots and my hands and arms, I made my way down this ancient stone ladder, descending into the darkness, with nothing but the dancing shadows cast by the orange light of the crank light as it played against my arms and the indentations in the wall. When at last my boots gained purchase on solid ground, I released my final hold on the wall and turned my face upwards towards the sky, finding it to be just as dark from below as it was from above, though the rain still splashed around me against the stone floor and dripped with its irritating coldness into my eyes. I quickly turned my face downward and wiped at the water, my fingers a little more warm and lifelike after the prolonged contact with the warmth of the stone wall, though my rain-slicked arms were still raised with goose flesh beneath the poncho. Once more, we slid the pack down and stripped out the wet outer layer, folding it into itself and onto itself, again and again, finally slipping the whole thing through a pocket to complete the little portable bundle, drawing the drawstring taut as I went. And then I decided to stuff it into the front pocket of the pack, hoping that the pockets were as waterproof as the rest of the bag, and saying a silent prayer for the notebook and the precious words that Lisa had left behind for me in case of an emergency. Finished, I swung the flashlight around and revealed what seemed to be a long stone hallway, large enough that 3 of me could walk abreast without much difficulty, enclosed at the top and sides by the same seamless stone, as if it had been carved out of the same piece of gigantic rock, rather than inlaid and buried beneath the earth. The walls showed, here and there, signs of their age, by ways of cracks in the wall face. Some long, others quite small indeed, and along the upper edge a sort of musty dampness made itself known, as if the rain itself were attempting to seep through the stone like a sponge. The walls themselves were blank, not filled with the carvings of the same unknown writing or pictures of whatever civilization had created the structure above, and the whole itself stretched out forward, far beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. Fortunately, we had never been of the claustrophobic sort, and I once more lifted the pack onto my shoulders, finding it more cumbersome than ever before, as my weary arms failed to make quick work of it, and set off through the darkness at a steady, albeit slow, pace. I looked down at my watch to check the time, but found it had shut down completely, some measure of the silver rain having gotten under the surface of its face. I could see it pulled inside. Figures. After a short walk, perhaps 5 minutes, we estimated, the flashlight beam fell at last upon a wall directly in my path, the hole opening up on either side as a fork, with each way extending out into darkness beyond the beam of the flashlight. Pausing for a moment, we stripped the worthless watch from my wrist and dropped it onto the ground at the fork in the hole before taking the path to the left, as I knew Lisa would have done, hoping the watch would serve as a marker towards the exit upon my return, upon her return, once I found her. Because I was going to find her. She was here, somewhere, at the end of whatever series of tunnels these were. I just knew it. I didn't know how I knew it, simply that I knew. For the feeling of surety was strong, and grew yet stronger with each step into the all-encompassing darkness of the subterranean world stretching out in stone before me. It wasn't long before the flashlight beam fell upon another wall directly in my path, its beam carrying timber. I paused to turn the crank to keep the light going, lest I find myself plunged into complete and total darkness, and thought for a long moment. If Lisa had come this way, she surely would have gone left. This I knew, but how would I find her way back when I found her, in order to bring her home after all these years? How cruel would it be that I would finally be reunited with my dear Lisa, the second half of my soul, only that we should both perish here, lost in the darkness, unable to find our way. And that is when the thought struck me. Quick as a flash, I reached into the pack for the remaining glow stick, and for the first time it struck me how hungry I was. I had, after all, been trekking through the forest most of the afternoon, and through the rain and night besides, in my panicked rush to find Lisa. I pressed my back against the wall as I slid down into a sitting position at its base, and relished the gentle warmth radiating from it into my back and my legs from the ground as well. Perhaps my soaking clothes might even dry as I thawed out some. I laid the glow stick aside at the base of the wall and withdrew a water bottle, cracking the seal on the top and drinking deeply. It burned slightly against my dry, raspy throat until it did its job of lubricating well enough. I nearly drained the first bottle before selecting one of the meal packets at random and ripping it open at the top to dump what was left of the water inside, and cracked open the second bottle to add more before mixing it through the powdered mush to reconstitute whatever it was meant to be, with a little plastic fork that had been adhered to the outside of the little packet. Tentatively, I took a bite of the unknown greyish-orange food, if you could call it that, and actually found it surprisingly pleasant. Some sort of dehydrated mashed potato mixed through with cheese flavouring and what was perhaps a hint of essence of chicken. It wouldn't have been my first choice, but it was food, and palatable enough, and I was hungry. It wasn't long before I had finished the lot of it, a finger rubbing inside the packet to ensure that it was truly empty. When I had finished, I thrust the wrapping back into the pack and snapped the glow stick in my hands to bring it to life. The bright purple struck me as odd after all the silver of the moon-soaked meadow and the dull orange of the flashlight. As I began to saw at the plastic with a survival knife. Once the work was done, I packed up, slipping the flashlight into my pocket to save myself the constant winding, while the glow stick would suffice. I dipped my index finger into the open end, careful not to poke myself on the rough plastic edges, and wiped a single line onto the wall of stone to mark my path before heading down the opening to the left, as I knew Lisa would have done herself. It wasn't long before another fork appeared, and once again I marked my path with a line and headed off to the left once more, hoping that I wasn't simply going in a circle. That fear was soon enough put to rest, as the wall before me rose up in a dead end, with no progress to be made either to the left nor to the right, and forcing me to double back. When I reached my mark at the fork, I added a second line, so that I might be able to recognise it, if I came this way once again, were I to get turned around by more dead ends, and set off to the right instead. And so I continued onwards in the darkness of this strange labyrinth. Left, right, centre fork, left again, dead end, double back, right once more, deciding where to go at random, as the forks in the stone appeared, and marking my path all the while with the strange liquid of the glow stick, which seeped into the crevices of my fingerprint, until the tip of my finger itself glowed with the strange purple fluorescence of whatever combination of chemicals brought it to life. My clothes were dry now, which was a relief, even if it left my skin vaguely itchy with the light gloss of sweat that had started to form. I was definitely tired now, and considered briefly stopping to take a short rest, but feared that I would fall asleep in this strange place. No, I had to press on. Lisa was here somewhere, waiting for me to find her. She needed my help. And so we trudged onwards, my boots feeling more and more like cinder blocks with each step, the light of the glow stick dwindling as I left more and more of its liquid on the walls to mark my path, becoming first frustrated by how often I would find myself doubling back, and then beginning to despair as my marks became tallies of my failures, vertical lines intersected at an angle every fifth time I would return to the same intersection, having gone around in circles. Onward still, we pressed into the darkness of the never-ending labyrinth after the ghost of my beloved, convinced that I should find her just around the next corner, and the next after that, only to be met time and time again with my own previously marked path. Anger swelled in my chest at the lack of direction as I plunged my way down another hole and around another turn and another, again and again, until I was sprinting for all I was worth around corners and throwing myself down dark holes by nothing more than the ever-diminishing light of the glow stick, taking frenzied swipe at my tallied marks with each pass. When at last I got no fluorescence from the plastic tube, I cast it at the floor and drew to a stop, catching my breath and wiping the sweat from my forehead. I pushed my trusty snapback back and returned it to its wonted place, using it to pull my hair as I breathed and looked about. The hallway once more opened to the left and to the right, and each side had been marked several times over with my passing. "Damn it, Lisa," I whispered aloud to no one. "You're the one with no sense of direction." I chuckled quietly as I pulled the flashlight from my pocket and began to work the crank with my tired arms. And just the echo of my laughter, as it was fading against the warm stone, I heard it. The gentle lilting of Lisa's laugh, just at the edge of my hearing, as if down the hall and to the left and around several corners. I would know that laugh anywhere. How many times had I heard its almost musical vibration fill the rooms of our home? After a fully intended pun, or while curled up on the sofa under the worn quilt that she loved so much, when the protagonist of some trashy, B-rated horror film made a stupid mistake. I took off at once at a run towards the sound, hurling myself around corners after her. "Lisa, wait!" I shouted at the unyielding stone, the heavy thudding of my boots on the ground resounding off the hardened walls as sweat poured from my brow, my flesh flushing with the exertion as I raced, half blind, through the holes. Right, left again, straight through the fork. I was beyond even trying to keep track as I sped onwards, even as the flashlight started to fade from want of winding. But I was gaining, I knew, for there, as I turned every corner, was a flash of a shadow just around the bend before it slipped into the darkness, leading me onwards and inwards, deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. Gone were the marks of my failed attempts to track my progress. There was only the same mirrored stone walls, impossible to tell from one from the other, save for perhaps some vague cracking that I might have been able to mark had I taken the time to properly look, and the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears like my heartbeat and the weariness of my whims. The loud, puffing breaths I took of the warm air, thick like steam in my lungs after coming out of a shower, and the glistening sweat on my arms and face. They were not going to stop me. Lisa was there, just out of sight, and I had to get to her. I had to. Onwards and onwards I raced, as my limbs became weighted, pushed beyond exertion, frenzied and frantic after the shadow that had Lisa's form, as I slipped ever onwards and out of sight, just at the edge of vision around the next corner, and the next, and the next. I was gaining, and couldn't afford to slow now, but my exhausted body would have no more, and I collapsed on the ground with a strangled cry of exertion. The frustration of being so close, and yet so far, leaking from my eyes in silver streams, down my flushed cheeks in the darkness of the labyrinth. I wept silently in the darkness, my tears feeling like steam as they hit the warmth of the hard stone under my face, unable to push myself forwards any further. Blindly, I managed to unsling the pack from my back, without rising, and curled around it, clutching its lumpy contents to my chest, and at last succumbed to sleep. I awoke some unknown time later, surrounded by complete darkness. How long had I been asleep? I had no way of knowing whether it was a few hours or a few days. So complete was the darkness when I opened my eyes that I wasn't certain they were truly open at all. I groaned, the sound bouncing off the walls in 1,000 fractals, as if a chorus of voices sung back at me, unseen in the darkness, and stretched my sore limbs. Sleeping on hard rock stone. I don't recommend it. I had soaked my clothes in sweat as I slept, and they clung to my frame. I couldn't do much about my chains, but I pulled the front of my shirt away from my body a few times to fan the still, humid air through and against my chest for a little relief before feeling around for the flashlight. I was still weary despite the sleep, but I had strength enough to continue onwards. Though I could already picture myself plodding along quite slowly. It didn't matter though. Slow and steady wins the race and all that. I cast about with my hands, seeking the flashlight, and couldn't find it either on my person nor within the pack. On my hands and knees, I felt around the surrounding area, searching for where it might have dropped when I realised, with a soft sigh of despair, that I must have dropped it during my mad last dash through these cursed tunnels. Well done, Celine, I seethed through clenched teeth. Some brilliant rescuer you are. I fished around in the pack blindly, and my hand gripped onto the last bottle of water. Carefully, I cracked the seal and drank, just a few sips before replacing it. I would need to conserve, with the oppressive warmth of the labyrinth around me. It would likely become my most precious resource in short order. Blindly, I pulled my sweat-filled boots from my feet, peeling my soaked socks off and stuffing them inside the pack unceremoniously and slowly standing on my feet. The stone was warm and smooth enough, like it had been baking in the sun on a sunny afternoon. I needn't worry about cutting myself at least. And in the darkness, the more I could employ my senses as I made my way through, the better. I hefted the pack back onto my back and shrugged a few times to adjust the added weight, before stretching my hand out to find the nearest hole. I had no way of knowing, of course, whether I'd be heading back the way I came or pressing onwards into the labyrinth. I wasn't too sure which way I wanted to go in either case, but the choice was out of my hands. My right index finger still glowed softly with the remnants of the glow stick, and so I chose it to be the hand which would trail the wall, giving me at least a hint of a visual cue as to the distance, so that I wouldn't smash into it repeatedly by mistake, and might be able to judge a corner. And so I set out once more, inching my way slowly through the darkness, my right hand tracing along the wall for indentations and cracks, the toes of my bare feet splaying gently against the warm stone to ensure even purchase. Nothing but the sound of my quiet, shuffling steps, barely resounding against the walls that seemed, at the same time, expansive as caverns around me, and yet pressing in upon me with the weight of the warm, humid air and heavy darkness. I came to a corner and pulled myself around it, clinging to the rock face on the right, toes curling carefully to ensure I wouldn't slip or smash into an angle, and then reached blindly across the empty expanse to make a turn to the left, my eyes straining through the complete darkness for any sign of light, but of course there was none, save the vaguely ghastly purple glow of my fingertip as it traced its way along the hard holes. And though they were smooth enough, it did begin to feel as though I were dragging my flesh across sandpaper from the repeated and unending contact. Onwards I went, the expanse seeming to stretch out forever before me, grateful, at the very least, that the ground was, more or less, perfectly even, without fear of slopes or inclines to trip upon. As I grew more comfortable with the darkness and my process, I began to grow a bit bolder with my footing and pace, finding myself in a comfortable walk rather than the slow inching that I had been doing for the better part of 2 hours. At least, it had been 2 hours in my estimation, and soon enough had worked up a bit of a sweat once more in the still, muggy air. The pack hung heavily on my shoulders, and a line of damp and unpleasant sweat had formed where my trusty snapback met my forehead. Had it not been the only thing holding my hair out of my face, I would have discarded it. But still, we pressed forward in the absolute darkness. I must have been mad to think that Lisa was down here. Disoriented, no doubt, by the exhaustion of my long trek through the woods and the bitter rain. I had been foolish. She'd been gone for 3 years. If she had been down here, she would have long perished without food or water in this sweltering heat. A quiet sob escaped me at the thought of her, lost and alone in the darkness as the end came for her. How scared and abandoned she must have felt. Lisa, my beautiful Lisa, you deserved so much better. I hung my head in shame and anguish as I pressed onwards in the darkness, brushing the bitter tears from my eyes, as if to clear them of the image of her. Huddled up in a corner somewhere, her red hair clinging to the sides of her face, sweat draining the life out of her soft curls, her pale cheeks pink with exertion from the heat and humidity of this damp place. I rounded another corner and another, hoping each time that I would spy the faint purple glow of my tally marks on the walls, leading me backwards towards the surface and out of this never-ending maze. And being disappointed each time as my mind continues to fill with nothing but the quiet sounds of Lisa's sobs in my mind. Had she thought of me in the end? Onwards I went, ignoring the tears as they rolled down my cheeks, to splatter with a quiet hissing, filling the air with some strange, intangible quality of haze in the darkness, as it squeezed tighter and tighter around me, the soles of my feet cooking softly against the stone that warmed and heated more with each passing step. My fingertips rubbed raw from dragging along the stone walls, the faint purple of the glow stick long since rubbed from the minute spaces between my fingertips. Indeed, it felt as though I had left the little ridges of my identity on the walls as well, sanded smooth by the deceptive stones, more akin to finely dusted shards of glass than the mirror-smooth rock I had believed it to be. The air was sweltering, and I closed my eyes against it, since it made no difference down here, in this cursed tomb of the damned, and shuffled onwards, the rough calluses forming on my feet as I went, and my thoughts strayed further from my beloved lost Lisa, and more towards my own demise. For surely I was going to meet the same cruel fate, doomed to wander about in the darkness, alone and baking in my own skin. At some point, I must have finished the rest of my water without realising it, and dropped the bottle to the ground, its hollow bouncing resounding down the hallway both behind and in front of me as it echoed, and it almost sounded to me again of Lisa's laughter. I opened my eyes once again into the sweltering heat and the haze, the blanket of suffocating night, straining after the sounds, as if I might be blessed with one last glimpse of her. And there, to my surprise, on the wall directly before me, where the endless holes split again left and right, was not my long-lost Lisa, but proof that she had come this way. And that proof came in a single line of pale fluorescence, marked upon the wall with a slim finger, the same way I had done to mark my own path. I rushed forward to trace my raw fingertips against it, as if they were trailing against her cheek. It was a faded cyan colour, her favourite, and I smiled. Of course she would have packed cyan sticks in her bag, and purple in mine. How long I stayed there, brushing my cheek against the mark of her passing, I couldn't say, for I was loath to leave its presence, and wished, with every ounce of my existence, to pry it from the unyielding surface of this subterranean prison, and keep it with me always. But at last I willed myself away from it, the shining beacon of light and hope in the darkness that my Lisa had always been, and pressed forward, hoping against hope that there would be another to the left fork. And there was, and then another, and another, and here, double marks to show that she had doubled back from a dead end just as I had done. I moved from one glowing mark to the next, interspersed with minutes, or hours, or days of darkness, until the next appeared, a softly glistening light of safety and completion, before plunging once more into the unforgiving unknown, ever closer, and yet never gaining on the spectre of her. But there, as the dim light of my eyes shone upon the wall ahead, a pinprick in the darkness, as I raced toward it, her hand, it must be, slipping around the corner of the light. "Lisa!" I shouted, my voice shattering, shrill and hoarse against the unseen walls around me, and I threw myself forward into a breakneck sprint, my bare feet thundering against the steaming floor through the darkness, my hands coming up to press against the next wall, only to push off and propel myself down the left and the next stretch of tunnels, and then again to the right, faster and faster. I was gaining on her. I could hear her breath as it sped away through my ears and the beating of my own heart. I bounced off one wall after another, hurtled down hallway after tomb-like hallway, ever onwards, even as my forearms were scraped against the rock and my heels dragged against the stone, trickles of blood left in the wall beneath the delicate markings of my dearest Lisa, unseen in the darkness, not able to be properly illuminated, even by the ghastly glow of her passing, until at long last, far off in the distance, something unknown, a pinprick of light, no larger than the point of the finest needle. Tendrils of wavering light assaulting my eyes after untold hours, wandering in the dark, surrounded by the oppressive heat and the hazy air of the tunnels, and my own mind fractured with grief. I hurtled towards it, caring naught as my toes scraped or cut against the now jagged floor, or broken stones as the path steadily inclined. The air thickened around me as the pinprick of light elongated, stretched and expanded before me as I pushed myself along the steep incline, my calves burning with exertion, stooping under the weight of the pack. Onwards I pushed, until at last I could take it no longer, the weight of the darkness and the stifling air becoming too much, and I flung the pack down as I slid to a stop. As the light shimmered and danced around me from a distance at the top of the incline, too far off to ascertain what it truly was, I fished around desperately in the pack, my bloodied palm seeking the notebook, not giving a second thought to the sound of the survival equipment spilling forth and tumbling down the incline. At last, my fingers closed around the notebook and I withdrew it, tucking it into the pocket of my jeans with the pen that was slotted into the metal spiral of its binding, and then turned back towards the light, fixed on it with a focus that burned through my brain and raged like fire through my veins, though my limbs were weak and trained, and my palms were bloody, and my back ached, and sweat dripped from my hair in streaming silver rivulets. And as the incline continued to steepen, I dropped to my hands and knees to pull myself along, slipping now and then from the blood, pouring freely from my palms as I scrambled desperately towards the light. The light grew, brighter and larger and closer with each motion, the hazy, humid air filling my lungs like water and coating the back of my throat with each fiery breath, until at last I burst forth through a circular opening in the stone into the shining brightness of a golden lit meadow, the sun above obscured by vague and billowing clouds, vague shapes of blue, purple, sage, pink, every colour of the rainbow, and still several more beyond name, swirling in invisible wind and drifting about seamlessly of their own accord. Exhausted and half blinded, dying of thirst and clutching at the silver grass, I pulled myself up into a sitting position, wiping my bleeding palms against my ragged and soaked jeans. That was when I saw her face. My beloved Lisa, not soaked in sweat and emaciated as she should have been after 3 years of being lost in this hellish labyrinth, but smiling, healthy, her curls bouncing with her light-hearted steps as she flitted across the meadow towards me. And I held her at last, bloodied and sweat-soaked, an exhausted, sobbing mess, but it didn't matter. I clung to the coolness of her arms and body, sobbing into her chest as her fingers ran over my arms and into my matted hair, smoothing it away from my face, feeling like satin after the glass-like terrain of the tunneled slope leading to this, the rainbow meadow of heavenly reconnection. Her voice in my ears, with its lilting, almost musical quality, and the blessed cool water, shining silvery from the little cup that she put to my lips, rolled down my parched throat like the cleansing waters of the Virgin herself. Lisa, my Lisa, this angel of a woman who I had set out to save, calming and saving me in turn from the horrors of that subterranean nightmare, vowing that I should never again be lost to that darkness, as she promised she would always be there with me. And she praised me for coming after her, after receiving her note asking for help. She wasn't certain, you see, that I would come. Time was a fickle thing, and she had no way of knowing how long it might take for her locket to reach me. I lay in her lap, my consciousness swirling about as the vague clouds above, babbling incoherently about the lost flashlight, the notebook with her final words, the town that had suspected that I would have ended the life of my one true love, as her smooth, cool fingers traced along my forehead in a soothing, endless circuit through my hair and down my jaw. And I listened as my long lost love told me of her own journey through the maze, and her discovery of this, the lost civilization of the true spirits of the ancients, destroyed by frost and cold, unable to exist without adequate coast. And through it all, I relished nothing so much as the stillness of the air and the gentle satin touch of the love of my life. This is why he marked the path for me. I managed, in my malaise and rapture, after these long years of desolation. I knew them at once by your favourite colour, my love. The soothing, unending circuit hesitated for a moment, and her voice faltered before it resumed, her gentle laugh filling my ears and washing over my weary body like slipping into a long-awaited bath. She always bought glow sticks in a bulk box from the outlet store. She was glad that they helped me to find my way. She thought that I would like the purple ones. Silent tears leaked from my eyes to roll down my cheeks, along with the chill that ran down my spine. And I knew at once the truth. Frantic, I floundered with my lead-filled silvery limbs and threw myself away, diving blindly back into the darkness, tumbling heavily down the incline, tripping over the remnants of the pack so haphazardly on my ascent. Exhausted and frantic, I made my way back through the labyrinth. The all-consuming darkness no longer an oppressive blanket, for the walls were alight with paintings, the words of an unknown language, begging for help and glorifying the return to the world, above, interspaced with tally marks that had led me towards my beloved Lisa, left behind with the horror that she had become. In desperation, I ripped my rattled and decaying snapback from my bed to hold over my mouth and nose, breathing in the stench of years of sweat, rather than the sickly sweet oppressive fog of the swirling rainbow clouds that filled the tunnels like a swimming pool. I ran, I stumbled, I crawled, I rolled, ever onwards, always away, tearing through the swamp of rainbow air, contained by unyielding stone walls, farther and farther from the sweltering heat, chasing after the faintest hint of chilled air through the open hole that led me into this horror. Right again, left fork, straight on, through loop after disorienting loop, even though the fog began to thin around me. The vibrant glow of the painted histories faded from sight around corners until there, the dim purple light of the glow stick, my own glow stick, that led me back to the surface, to escape, to freedom from the oppression imposed by these endless and unforgiving stone walls. And at last, up the carved ladder, I dragged my body up and out, part sliding, part crawling, part swimming across the soaked and muddy grass, away from the towering sculpture and the hallucinations of my beloved Lisa. Even as my exhaustion saw the loss of my feet, the chill of the autumn air stiffened my limbs. My hair, brittled by forming ice, snagged, caught and snapped off like so many shards of glass. Thistles and fallen branches stretched and caught at my frozen legs as I made my way in desperation back towards civilization. The moon chased the sun in an endless circle across the sky as I pulled my freezing form along the forest floor. At last I reached a marker, a single plastic tube, its self-fueled fluorescence no longer holding sway as it dangled in the frigid breeze. Pulling myself against it, near the last true marking of my beloved Lisa, her footprint, fossilized in the stone-cold ground between the roots. I can no longer go on. The cold is all-consuming, draining away any hope at meaningful progress. So why have I decided to spend my remaining hours scrolling with frozen fingers in this blood-stained notebook that contains Lisa's final words? Because they're coming. They're real. They're inside me now, though my exhausted state and failing body are enough to prevent their progress towards town. To whoever finds this, they may already be among us. Among you. Look for the signs. They cannot survive the cold. The stones of the labyrinth have sanded off their fingerprints, as they have mine. And if you can see the tally marks, it's already too late.